Thank you for joining us back. Now let's move straight ahead to our discussion segment. And this morning on Daybreak, we turn our attention to a story that has sparked widespread debate across the country: the controversy surrounding the 2025 tax laws. Now, over the past weeks, questions about alleged discrepancies between the versions of the Tax Reform Act passed by the National Assembly and those later gazetted have stirred public outrage. Now, critics, including the Nigerian Bar Association and prominent civil society groups, have raised concerns over transparency, legislative integrity, and the potential economic consequences of implementing laws amid such uncertainty. NBA President Afam Osigwe has warned that rushing these laws could unsettle businesses, erode investor confidence, and create unpredictability for citizens and institutions expected to comply. Now, adding to the debate, former Vice President Tukur Abubakar has called for the suspension of the laws and a full investigation, describing any unauthorized alterations as a threat to constitutional democracy. And meanwhile, some regional groups, including the Arewa Consultative Forum, have echoed concerns about the legality and legitimacy of the gazetted documents, highlighting the need for safeguard citizens and protect national economic interests. On the other side, the federal government insists that due process was followed and implementation is set to proceed in January 2026, despite ongoing calls for clarification and review. With businesses and households waiting in uncertainty, the stakes are high, both for governance and for ordinary Nigerians who will live under these new tax rules. To discuss these developments and provide insight into the Arewa region's position, we're joined via Zoom from Kaduna by the National Publicity Secretary of the Arewa Consultative Forum, Professor Tukur Muhammad-Baba. Professor Baba, thank you for joining us. Let's start with your thoughts on the controversy. Now, what are the key issues sorry, I beg your pardon. Let me just move straight ahead to, the concerns of Nigerians. Now, Nigerians are angry and confused at the same time about the current tax law changes. Now, from a legal standpoint, what exactly triggered this public outrage? Is it, the content of the tax laws themselves, or the uncertainty around how they've been applied?
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that the position I am clarifying today is not necessarily that of a regional position. It is national. You remember these tax laws, the four that were submitted to the National Assembly, were not submitted by a regional group as such. They were passed constitutionally by the National Assembly. So everything about it affects the whole nation. Now, the ACF is particularly concerned because during the legislative process, the organization made extensive and very comprehensive suggestions as to observations and recommendations about the shortcomings of the laws that were before the National Assembly. And about 80% or more of the recommendations made by this organization were reflected and concerns addressed fairly satisfactorily. So the outrage right now is not, that the North is only, everybody is affected, from Calabar to Ilela, from Calabar in Cross River State to Ilela in Sokoto State, like I keep saying, from Baga to Badagry, everyone is affected. Now, it is deeply concerning that a law constitutionally passed would be subjected to deletions, modifications, insertions, and so on, outside of the mandate given by the National Assembly. And of course, you know that taxation is what affects everyone. As you have observed, it affects individuals and businesses. And not only that, lawmaking should be sacrosanct, which means the decisions of the legislator, whatever their shortcomings, should be respected and not subjected to what you can say, amounts to executive forgery, if I may use that strong word. But if I can address your issue, the problem is national and not sectional. And it is worrying that we are practicing democracy front door, but busy dismantling it back door. That is a threat to national stability.
I know, Professor Baba, looking at the tax law that we've seen, the controversies surrounding it and discrepancies, we've seen conflicting statements from different government agencies. At this point, which version should Nigerians believe and why should they trust it? Because so far, nothing has been transparent when it came to the tax law, especially when it came to discrepancies. So how are Nigerians supposed to believe and agree with what they should trust so far?
I think what should be trusted and what should be believed is the exact version passed by the legislature, because that was done in accordance with due process. If you ask me which version should be believed, it should be the actual one that was passed. Remember, the controversy was first raised by a legislator exercising his right to contribute to the legislative process. If someone as important as a legislator will say this wasn't what we passed, then we should ask that the National Assembly should make available the original copy so that we will compare and contrast to see what happened. But obviously, the legislator, as honorable as he is, will not raise such a question, such a serious challenge as to a difference between what was passed by the National Assembly and what has, and of course, signed by the president in accordance with constitutional provisions, but of course, a new version or a moderated or altered version appearing in the Gazette, which will be the guiding principle for implementation. So if you ask me, in short, we should believe the version that the National Assembly passed and was assented to by the president. And if there is any discrepancy, it should be properly investigated.
All right. Now, we know that public trust is very important. Many Nigerians are saying this law feels imposed and not negotiated. So how much of this outrage is really about taxes and how much is it about trust at this point?
There are two issues. The first of all is the trust issue. Now, how much tax to be collected is a secondary issue for now. The most important issue to determine, in my opinion, is what exactly were the provisions that were approved by the National Assembly. Good or bad, the version approved by the National Assembly will be the guiding principle. Of course, if the public is dissatisfied, and of course, the public has every right to be dissatisfied with the taxation system, it can be pointed out that, look, this was subjected to parliamentary procedure. And like I've said, quite a number of individuals and groups and organizations had made contributions during the processing of the bills as approved by the National Assembly. So good and bad, it reflected the decision of the elected representatives of the people. And of course, no law, no constitutional provision is ever sacrosanct. Of course, from time to time, there arise needs for amendment here and there. But right now, I think the most fundamental issue is to determine what exactly was passed by the National Assembly. And if there are any differences, who authorized those differences, and for our lawyers to decide what is exactly the legal status of an altered document, altered from what the legislature has passed.
All right, Professor Baba, still talking about the transparency and, trust issues when it comes to the government and the people concerning the tax law. We've seen businesses, complain that they don't even know which taxes apply as in who collects them and how much they would eventually pay. Now, looking at this, isn't this certainty one of the core principles of a fair tax system? Because if you're bringing out such a tax law, it should be clear for the ordinary Nigerians to understand where their money is going to and what those monies will be used for at the end of the day.
Well, I didn't quite catch the full question, but like I said, there are two issues there. What law was exactly passed and what has been gazetted? If there is a difference, then there is a fundamental problem. It will seem to me, going through some of the accusations of deletions, modifications, and so on, it seems to me that the executive branch of government is trying to confer excessive authority outside of the judicial system on the tax administrative structure. For example, doing things outside of court order, denominating tax assessment in dollars, as if we are not independent. I wonder what happens to pride in our national currency, the naira, and so on. What happens to our political and economic independence, relative, and so on. So that is one. And of course, businesses under the circumstances, especially the daunting economic difficulties being experienced by operators, have a right to complain, as do citizens who have a right to complain that, okay, taxation is all right, but what is happening to the taxation? Who is collecting? What is being done with it? For example, if you go back, if we check, a lot of things that are happening are questionable. A recent audit submitted to the National Assembly saw a lot of money, or accusation of a lot of money missing in the NNPC. Who took that? Trillions of naira is not a needle that will disappear in the ocean. So citizens have a right to complain. But I think what is before us now is not just the right, but exactly what law was approved by the National Assembly, which is independent and sovereign in its decisions.
All right, now you spoke about shifting responsibility from the federal government to the tax office. Now, at this point, we have seen the discrepancies that have been highlighted. At some point, the tax office would have the authority to be able to go after a tax offender or, arrest and things like that. So what safeguards do you think should exist to ensure enforcement doesn't become another avenue for harassment or corruption?
The judicial system, the third arm of government, should be trusted to do its job. No judicial powers should be conferred on the tax authority, because that is like merging the judiciary and the executive together. There are checks and balances, and that's what democracy is all about. The tax authority should not be given such absolute powers, because, as you know, the popular aphorism is absolute power corrupts. And the essence of democracy, like I said, is checks and balances. The tax authorities should not be allowed to be accuser, judge, and juror in tax matters. No, we have clear lines of responsibility between the different arms of government, and that should be respected. Unless, of course, we are not practicing democracy, we are practicing a new brand of totalitarianism or dictatorship. That should not be allowed to happen. This is a democracy, a young one at that, and it should be allowed to prosper. It should be allowed to grow through observing respecting the differences in responsibilities and duties between the three arms of government.
So, Professor Baba, there's still also the federal and the state tension when it comes to the controversies concerning this tax law. I mean, the question still remains who has the legal rights to collect, certain taxes when it comes to, is it, the federal or the state government, and how much of this saga is really about constitutional power struggles rather than revenue generation?
And it's a legitimate concern. The provisions of the Constitution are clear. Now, this tendency towards centralizing powers in the federal, in the executive at the federal level is worrying, and it should be concerning. We all talk about allowing democracy to grow. We all talk about allowing the different levels of governments, states, local governments, to stay independent. So the Constitution is very clear as to what powers each of the different levels of government has. And I think the fundamental thing is to allow the states to negotiate in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution. We cannot want democracy on one hand. So we cannot demand democracy on the one hand, and then we keep talking of centralization of authority and functions as if this is a military regime. It is not.
All right, Professor Baba.
And I think the states have a right to make demands in accordance with the provisions of the law.
All right. Now, Professor Baba, we've seen that a lot of associations, a lot of people have suggested that this tax law should be suspended pending investigation because these allegations are serious allegations at this point. Do you think that the government would take that suggestion, or would they decide to go ahead and implement it in January? And do you think that it is workable and legally defensible?
As you have pointed out, the Nigerian Bar Association has raised issues. To me, the issue is simple. What we have now, or what is being presented to the public and raising this controversy, is it in accordance? Is it in strict accordance with the provisions as passed by the National Assembly? I'm not a lawyer. But if, of course, there had been deletions, modifications, insertions, and so on, ipso facto, that is an illegal law. You cannot implement something that is illegal. So to me, the question of whether it should be implemented, it should be delayed, and so on, begs the question. If there had been changes, ipso facto, the law that is being presented is illegal, and it should be challenged. And as I've seen, a number of groups saying they will challenge it in court, and I think that is proper. In short, what we have now is not the law, and you cannot implement something that is not the law. Again, I reiterate, this is a democracy. It's not an authoritarian system of government. You cannot, for example, if I can speak from an academic perspective, or what has been out, you cannot say that a certificate that is forged has been issued. So therefore, until some time, you will continue to insist on that forgery. A forgery, in my opinion, is a nullity. This means if there have been changes, it's not a law. We should go back to the fundamentals. We should go back to what has been passed. That is the law. So to me, for the federal government to insist it will go ahead, I think it's an expression of contempt. Contempt for the Nigerian citizen, contempt for the legislature, and of course, deodorizing illegalities. This is not what the government should do. So in short, if you ask me if it should be delayed, and I will reply that why should be delayed? You cannot delay a zero phenomenon, as far as I'm concerned. But of course, you can get lawyers to clarify that.
I still talking about the delay of the tax laws. I mean, some groups, including the Afenifere and Pandef, have taken opposing positions on whether the laws should be suspended or implemented. Now, would love to hear from you from a northern perspective. What is the Arewa Consultative Forum stance at this point?
The stance of the Arewa Consultative Forum is that the law, as passed by the National Assembly, as assented to by the President, should be reinstated. Like I said, you cannot implement something that has not been passed by the legislature. And if for any reason there have been changes, it should go back to the National Assembly. So, like I said earlier, you cannot implement something that is not the law. Right now, we don't have a law. Right now, what we seem to have is forgery. We cannot sanctify forgery by saying, oh, okay, well, we will make changes and so on. No. The fundamental question is, why were there the changes? And how does it render the law itself? Like I said, something that was not passed should not be implemented. So I think the federal government should go back on whether we should implement now on the 1st of January or not. What Nigerians should demand is that the standing order should be the legislation as passed by the National Assembly. That should be the guiding principle and nothing else. So whether it should be delayed or implemented is not the issue. The issue is, what is the law?
All right, Professor, looking at this controversy so far, what lessons do you think this controversy reveal about how economic policy is communicated in Nigeria?
Inconsistency. You will please recall that, in fact, this is not the first time that there has been an attempt by the executive to interfere with provisions of the law as passed by the National Assembly. If I may recall fully, during the regime of, I think, President Olusegun Obasanjo, such accusations has come. And one is hoping that lessons have been learned. And of course, the opposition to the 4 tax bills submitted to the National Assembly by various segments of society should have taught a lesson. But it looks like no lessons have been learned. But the main thing now is should be a realization that the Nigerian citizens are not fools. That the legislature, as much as we accuse it of certain shortcomings, is still alive to its duty. It could see the difference between what is passed, passed, and what is now being presented to the public. And I think we should applaud the legislator that raised the issue, and we should applaud the National Assembly leadership that said all the issues will be investigated. And I think this should be done without delay. And the executive ought to know that, look, you are not dealing with people who will just accept anything you throw at them. Too many things have been done with impunity by the current administration. And it is regrettable, it is disappointing, but of course, we hope someone somewhere realizes that you can't take the people for granted. And all garrulous and shouting that, yeah, we'll do it regardless, will not work. There are limits to impunity by the executive, by absolutely anybody.
Professor, quickly, before we go, in practical terms, what should Nigerians expect in coming weeks regarding these laws? And what message would you like to give to both the government and citizens about ensuring fairness, accountability, and economic stability?
For Nigerians, we should stay alert. For government, the government needs to rethink its strategy of going ahead with certain policies regardless of what the populace want, or thinking that everything is necessary, everything every criticism is necessarily opposition. It is not opposition. It is respect for due process. This government is in power, presumably on the basis of due process. Its actions should therefore reflect and respect that due process as far as any of its policies that affect the citizens are concerned.
All right. All right. Thank you very much, Professor Tukur Baba, for being here and shedding so much light on the plight of Nigerians when it comes to the tax law.
Thank you for speaking with us.
It's been my pleasure. Yeah. Thank you, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to Nigerians. I hope the new year will be one in which the government respects the sovereignty of the legislature and the wishes of the populace.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, we've come to the end of this segment. We'll be going on a quick break. When we come back, we'll be looking at the front pages of the national dailies and see what made it there, so make sure you stay tuned.